Aloha, social scientists. This lecture will review the key differences between the two broad frameworks, naturalism and interpretivism. Here is the lecture outline. I'll begin with a broad overview of each framework, then discuss more specifically approaches to theory and methods, concept development, and the role of objectivity. All right, so now is a good time to make sure that you have that table separating naturalism and interpretivism handy, either on your laptop to fill in or print it out to handwrite, either way. The first term should look familiar to you, naturalism. This term came up in the first week's reading and is referring to the approach to social science, inquiry, and research that resembles the natural sciences, such as biology, chemistry, or physics. Now, before I review in further detail the content on the slide, I want to clarify a misunderstanding that came up in several of the discussion posts for week one. And that is that the term naturalism does not in any way indicate or mean that research, theory, or methods are, quote, natural. What the term is referring to, rather, is an approach to conducting social science, which includes theorizing methods and analysis, that favors or privileges the approaches taken within the natural sciences, which is largely based on standardized observations or empiricism. So, at the broadest level, we can understand naturalism as an approach that relies upon empiricism, uh, like I stated, and interpretivism as an approach that is a reaction to naturalism. So, naturalists essentially seek to conform to the approaches of the natural sciences. And interpretivists are critical of an over reliance on causal laws or explanations taken by naturalists when studying the social world. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly review the main difference in terms of an approach to theory and research methods that are taken by either the naturalist camp or the interpretivist camp. So, naturalists and those within this approach to social science research emphasize that theory should be standardized and objective. Therefore, it needs to come from a set of statements or social laws that attempt to explain social phenomena, and ideally with predictions um, included in that theory. And in order to test those theories, a naturalist is going to seek to utilize standardized and objective research methods. So this would be something like a survey. Interpretivists, on the other hand, are again very much reacting to the approach taken by naturalists and empiricists and claim that causal laws and explanations miss a lot of complexity about the social world, and that in fact our social theories operate more like the way translating or interpreting a text than standardized laws. And this is where the name interpretivism comes from, right? So I emphasize that word there. And so interpretivists view social research as akin to interpreting the observations that are taking place. And the person doing the interpreting in this case is the researcher, and that matters. So the data collection, in order to be a good and adequate representation of what is happening in the social world, regardless of the actual site or space, should be done in such a way that can collect nuance and detail. All right, so building upon the approaches to theory and methods, we're going to talk a little bit about concept development. And all of this really goes hand in hand. So, naturalists, who are researchers within social sciences, whom favor quantitative approaches, right? Because quantitative research approaches are well suited to standardize ways of measuring things. And so this is a good time to get out the Buce-Perry aggression scale and look at that as we talk about this. So a naturalist is essentially going to approach concept development as that the theories that exist within the discipline, right? So whether it's psychology, economics, anthropology, sociology, that the theory should create or generate concepts, right? So in the example of the video games and aggression, what would take place would be that a theory, as highlighted on page 3 of the chapter, social learning theories, would generate concepts, right? So the social learning theories are reviewed here in this example of video games and aggression. And from those theories, a researcher would generate concepts to then measure. And because naturalists are seeking to emulate the natural sciences, they are concerned with construct validity. And essentially, construct validity is the extent to which you are measuring what you intend to measure. So if you have a series of questions on a survey that are intending to measure aggression, the concern of construct validity is, how do you know you're actually measuring aggression as opposed to something else? So if you take a look at the Buce-Perry scale, you can see that there's a scale at the top, 1 to 7, and I'm sure many of you have seen this before in different settings. And anytime we see a scale like this, whether it's 1 to 7 or 1 to 5, we know we're using a Likert scale. This is a commonly used and well-established measurement tool in survey research. So on one side we have the 1, which is extremely uncharacteristic of me, and on the other hand we have a 7, which is extremely characteristic of me. And then we have these series of questions that a participant could then answer. And at the bottom of the page, you'll see that these questions are actually grouped into categories. So 1 through 9 is intended to measure physical aggression. So this would be a scale for physical aggression. Questions 10 through 14 seek to measure verbal aggression. Questions 15 through 21 seek to measure anger. And questions 22 through 29 seek to measure hostility. So right here, we can kind of think about the various ways that even you might look at some of these questions and think, well, depending on my mood, or perhaps if something had recently happened to me, I may answer this question really differently, right? And so that's what researchers are concerned with when they are concerned with construct validity, right? So this is the approach taken by the naturalists when developing concepts to then measure in their survey instruments that they administer to participants to then collect data and conduct analyses with. So interpretivists, on the other hand, highlight and emphasize that our concepts that researchers use and seek to measure or observe very much reflect our own language and the context and culture that we are a part of when conducting social science research. And because especially researchers within and across academia have such a different vocabulary and training when it comes to language and to talking about big ideas and social theories and concepts, it's important to consider the distance, the social distance, or the differences in the language of the researcher and the participant, right? And that the context in which research is being conducted, the time and the place, whether the researcher is an insider or an outsider, which is relevant to culture, that all of these things matter. Interpretivists, however, don't see this necessarily as a weakness to research or as a reason to not conduct research in the social sciences, but rather as something that just warrants and deserves close and careful examination. Okay, so the last theme that I want to highlight is the role of objectivity and the position that naturalists and interpretivists take on this when it comes to conducting research. So, if you recall from last week, we read and thought about objectivity and values. And in the broadest sense, we can think of objectivity as anything that is neutral, factual, apolitical, and free from subjective bias or opinions, which is a tall order, as we will see throughout the rest of this summer session, especially when it comes to studying the social world, which we are all a part of. So, naturalists take the position that research should operate as close to the moderate thesis of value freedom as possible. And that is in last week's chapter. And that researchers can remain neutral insofar as they relate their theories, their theories that come from their disciplines, to the observations or data they're collecting, and use neutral descriptions. And this is sometimes referred to, and we'll talk a little bit more in the next lecture about this, as a thin description. Right? So essentially, the idea is just report the facts. So whatever you find, just stick to that, report it, and you've done your job. You've done your due diligence when it comes to remaining objective. Interpretivists, on the other hand, really take the position that there is just never a way that the interpretations that take place by the researchers or even a research team, that they can be neutral or value free, that there will always be some type of bias or influence that makes its way into these interpretations. And this is most obvious when we consider the legacy and history of anthropology and the way that this discipline really began with a lot of Western academics, primarily male, who would go into a lot of indigenous communities and report back on them. And it's definitely a legacy that the discipline has come a long way from, but this is an example that is a classic example of this taking place. Nonetheless, it's something that still takes place, especially across the social sciences. So interpretivists really view language as a significant part of social life, right? It's the way we communicate with one another and interact with each other to do everything, to get anything done. And that because the influence of language is so significant, that researchers should really take great measures to appropriately and accurately reflect the culture and social reality of the participants who they are observing. And that in order to do this, they need to include a lot of detail and immerse themselves in the culture to better understand the signs and the symbols and what the words mean. And we can think about how, even here in Hawaii, if you are not local or if you are not a native Hawaiian, there are going to be a lot of expressions and words that might not make sense to you, and that it would be easy to inaccurately represent them or inaccurately report them. But a way to avoid that, according to interpretivists, is to immerse yourself in your research site and thickly describe what you are observing. So the next lecture is going to talk more about thick versus thin description and its role in the qualitative research approach.